In the summer of 1565, a siege that lasted 4 months unfolded. Something no one believed was possible. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful empire in the world, stretching across 3 continents with hundreds of warships and tens of thousands of elite soldiers, arrived to crush a community smaller than a modern town. One side brought cannons, siege towers, music, war, galleys, and an army so vast it turned the sea black with sails. The other side had old stone fortresses, a few hundred knights and civilians holding whatever music, weapons they could find. On paper, this wasn't a battle. It was an execution. And yet, the Siege of Malta, music became something no one could have imagined, a confrontation where courage mattered more than numbers, where an exhausted music island refused to surrender, and where the outcome determined who would control the Mediterranean and who would shape the future of Europe. This is a story of how a place that should have been forgotten became the battlefield that changed everything. For most people in the mid-1500s, the Mediterranean wasn't just water. It was the center of the world, the highway of trade, faith, and power. Ships from Spain, Italy, North Africa, and the Ottoman-controlled East all crossed this sea, each representing kingdoms trying to shape the future in their own image. But 2 forces stood out above the rest. On one side was the Ottoman Empire, the strongest state on the planet. By 1565, it controlled vast territories from Egypt to Hungary. Its armies were feared, its navy unmatched, and its ambitions guided by a belief that God had chosen them to rule the heart of the world. For decades, the Ottomans had pushed westward, taking key islands like Rhodes and Cyprus, tightening their grip around the Mediterranean like a vice. On the other side were the Knights of St. John, known to many Europeans simply as the Knights Hospitaller. They were far smaller, almost insignificant in comparison, a warrior order without a real homeland, driven out of Rhodes years earlier by the same Ottoman armies now, planning their next strike. To survive, the Knights rebuilt their identity on the rocky island of Malta, a place with little water, less farmland, and almost no natural protection. But they turned that disadvantage into something sharper, a reputation for being the only force stubborn enough to challenge Ottoman expansion directly. To the Ottomans, the Knights were more than an annoyance. They were a threat to prestige, a symbol of defiance, sitting right on the empire's trade routes. Their galleys attacked Ottoman supply. Ships disrupted commerce and insulted the authority of the Sultan. Each raid was a message: we are still here and we are not afraid. By the early 1560s, Sultan Sulian the Magnificent decided that the situation could no longer be ignored. He was old, but his ambition had not faded. Rhodes had been reclaimed. Now Malta would follow. Removing the Knights would clear the sea for Ottoman dominance and open the door to further expansion into the western Mediterranean. The plan was enormous in scale. In early 1565, the Ottoman court began preparing one of the largest amphibious operations of the century. Armories in Istanbul forged thousands of musket barrels. Shipyards along the Golden Horn built and refitted dozens of galleys and transports. Provisions, grain, gunpowder, water casks were stored in staggering amounts. The army was handpicked. Janissaries, Sepahi, cavalry, elite corsair crews, artillery, specialist engineers, sappers, and thousands of troops from across the empire. As these preparations moved forward, the Knights in Malta also sensed that something terrible was approaching. Their Grandmaster, Jean Diolet, had spies and informants across the sea. Whispers grew louder. The Ottomans were coming, and they were coming in force. The stage was set. A superpower determined to crush an enemy it despised, a small island preparing to resist a blow it had no right to survive. The storm had not yet arrived, but everyone could feel the air tightening as if the Mediterranean itself was holding its breath. While the Ottoman war machine prepared, its thunder, Malta moved with a different rhythm, quieter, slower, but guided by a level of discipline and resolve that bordered on desperation. For the Knights of St. John, survival had never been guaranteed. They had learned long ago that when the enemy was larger, stronger, and richer, victory came from the smallest advantages, the trick nobody expected, the detail that changed everything, the moment when courage filled music, the spaces where numbers failed. At the center of it all stood John Deolet. Music. He wasn't the youngest commander nor the strongest, but he carried something far more important: experience. He had fought in Rhodes. He had been a prisoner in Ottoman hands. He understood better than anyone what was coming, and he knew that once the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon, there would be no escape, no reinforcements in time, no safe harbor to retreat into. So Valat prepared the island as if it were a single fortress. First, he focused on the land. Malta's geography was harsh. Rocky ridges, steep cliffs, narrow bays. But in the hands of military minds, these became weapons. Engineers reinforced the walls of Fort St. Elmo and Fort St. Angelo, adding earth-filled bastions to absorb cannon fire. Sappers dug trenches, built hidden firing positions, and shaped the ground so that every step the Ottomans took would place them under crossfire. Gates were sealed, drawbridges repaired, walls inspected stone by stone. Then came the people. The knights could not fight alone. They trained Maltese villagers, armed city militias, and organized teams for carrying water, powder, and medical supplies. Anyone who could hold a tool, a bucket, or a musket became part of the defense. Valat moved among them daily, speaking plainly, never promising survival, only purpose. He knew fear was natural music, so he replaced it not with lies, but with clarity. The Ottomans are coming, he told his men. We cannot outrun them, so we will outlast them. One of the sharpest minds in Valais. Circle was the military engineer, Francesco Laparelli, whose talent lay in predicting what the enemy would do before they even thought of it. He studied maps, measured angles of fire, and adjusted fortifications so precisely that weeks later, Ottoman commanders would complain that every approach they attempted was countered before they could even commit to it. Laparelli's most important insight was simple. The knights must force the Ottomans into a siege of attrition, not a fast assault. Speed favored the Ottomans. Time favored Malta. So the knights prepared the island not for victory, but for endurance. They stockpiled food deep under the fortresses. They rationed gunpowder, storing barrels in cool chambers carved directly into the limestone. Sharpshooters were assigned elevated nests. Cannon placements were rotated so no enemy could map the firing patterns. At the same time, Valais made a crucial decision. One historian still debate. He ordered the destruction of all surrounding farmland, wells, and buildings outside the main strongholds. It was brutal, but it denied the Ottoman shelter, clean water, and supplies the moment they landed. Every field burned was a day bought from Malta. Every destroyed house was one less cover for Ottoman sharpshooters. Then came the psychological preparations. The knights knew that morale would be as important as steel. They held short nightly vigils, not as empty rituals, but as moments of unity. They walked the Battlements at dawn to show their men. That leadership was present, awake, music, and willing to die first if it came to that. Wounded soldiers were not hidden away. They were treated in view of others to show that sacrifice would not be forgotten. But for all their planning, Valet knew something cold and unspoken. If the Ottoman fleet truly brought the numbers rumored across Europe, Malta would be outmatched beyond any rational calculation. There was no guarantee the island could withstand even the first month music of assault. Still, the knights held fast. They had their fortresses. They had their cannons. They had their resolve carved as deep into the music limestone as the tunnels beneath the city. In early May, lookouts along the coast reported distant sails, music, faint at first, then multiplying across the horizon like growing storm clouds. Drums echoed from inside the fortresses. Church bells rang through Valletta's narrow streets. Civilians ran for shelter. The knights took their positions along the walls. The preparations were over. The waiting was over. The largest Ottoman armada the Mediterranean had seen since the fall of Constantinople was arriving, and Malta, this small sun-beaten island, braced itself for a battle music that would push both courage and cruelty to their limits. The morning the Ottoman fleet arrived began in silence. Malta's shoreline, usually bright under the Mediterranean sun, darkened under a forest of masts, pushing steadily toward the island. To the knights, it looked less like a fleet and more like a moving continent. Hundreds of sails layered in tight formation, sweeping forward with the confidence of a superpower certain of its own destiny. People would later say that the sea changed color from the cliffs above Grand Harbor. It looked true. The water wasn't blue anymore. It was black, covered by ships so tightly grouped that the waves themselves seemed to disappear beneath them. Inside Fort St. Elmo and Fort St. Angelo, men rushed to their posts. Signal flags were raised. Cannon crews loaded powder. Charges. Lookouts shouted distances, ship counts, and directions. Even the air felt different. Hotter, heavier, like the island had suddenly fallen under the shadow of something far larger than itself. The Ottoman fleet approached in perfect order. At the center were the war GS, their oars rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. Around them clustered transport ships, carrying soldiers, artillery, siege, tools, and supplies. Farther back sailed the command vessels, marked by banners of deep green and crimson, snapping sharply in the wind. When the lead ship reached within range, the first signal drum sounded, a deep, rolling thunder that spread from ship to ship, echoing across the harbor. It was the announcement. The siege of Malta had begun. The Ottomans wasted no time. Within hours, landing craft slammed onto the beaches north of the island, spilling thousands of soldiers onto the rocky ground. Janistries advanced in disciplined lines, shields held tight, while sappers surveyed the land for gun placements. Carts carrying heavy cannons were unloaded next, oxen strained as artillery crews dragged bronze siege guns up the inclines toward positions overlooking Fort St. Elmo. By dusk, the Ottomans had turned the northern peninsula into a fortified camp. Tents, arranged in rows, powder magazines, buried, trenches cut through the earth with frightening speed. The knights watched all of this from across the harbor. They knew the first blow would fall on St. Elmo. The fort was smaller, exposed on three sides, and sat like a dare placed at the water's edge. Valet had reinforced it heavily, but everyone understood one truth. St. Elmo was never meant to win the siege. Its purpose was to delay the enemy, to bleed the Ottomans, slow them, and by the island, time and the knights were prepared to defend it to the last man. At sunrise, The next day, the Ottomans revealed their strength. Dozens of cannons, some weighing more than a horse, were positioned along the ridge facing St. Elmo. When they fired, the ground didn't just shake, it roared. The first volley tore into the outer walls of the fort, smashing parapets, throwing dust into the air and sending chunks of limestone flying like shot against the defenders. Inside the fort, chaos erupted. Sentries ducked behind barricades. Engineers raced to repair damage. Doctors carried the first wounded down into underground chambers. But the knights didn't break. When the smoke cleared between volleys, musketeers lined the walls, returning fire at Ottoman sharpshooters. Every time a janissary stepped into the open, a bullet snapped past his head. Every time an Ottoman gun crew tried to reposition a cannon, musket fire rained down on them from impossible angles. The fort was bleeding, but so were the attackers. By the third day, the Ottoman commanders realized St. Elmo would not fall quickly. They intensified the bombardment, focusing fire on two key points, the ravelin and the fort's main gate. Once these broke, infantry could rush inside. Engineers moved forward, under shields, trying to plant explosives at the base of the walls. Arrows and bullets poured down from above, but the Ottomans advanced relentlessly, shield over shield, forming human tunnels that crawled toward the stone. On the fourth night, sappers managed to detonate charges. Beneath the ravelin, the explosion sent a section of the wall collapsing inward, lighting up the sky in a burst of fire and dust. Ottoman soldiers cheered. The path was open. Before dawn, janissaries prepared for the assault. They sharpened their blades. They painted their faces. Some tied strips of cloth around their arms, a sign among elite units that they expected to die. Inside the fort, the knights felt the ground tremble from the constant cannon fire. Smoke seeped through cracks in the stone. Messages were sent across the harbor to Valais. St. Elmo is beginning to fall apart, but Valais' reply was always the same. Hold. He knew the longer street Elmo resisted, the fewer soldiers the Ottomans would have when the real battle, the fight for Bairou and Sanga, finally began. Just after sunrise, trumpets rang out from the Ottoman camp. The ground shook under the weight of thousands, music of feet. Janus charged through the breach, shields raised, swords drawn. The knights met, music them heeding. For a moment, the breach became a storm of steel, men crashing into each other in close quarters, muskets firing, music at point-blank range, smoke curling around bodies as both sides fought in a blur of desperation. St. Elmo's defenders forced the first wave back, then the second, then the third, but the Ottomans kept coming. By midday, the heat was punishing. Blood darkened the stones. Every wall inside the fort showed scars from cannonballs, music, explosions, and the weight of bodies thrown against it. The defenders were exhausted. The attackers were relentless. Still, the fort did not fall. When night came, both sides retreated only far enough to drag away the wounded, clean weapons, and wait for the next day's brutality. And everyone on Malta knew if this was only the beginning, the rest of the siege would be unlike anything the island had ever seen. When Fort St. Elmo refused to collapse, the Ottomans changed their strategy. They didn't abandon the attack. They widened the battlefield. 4 weeks, St. Elmo had consumed their time, their gunpowder, and far too many men. So the commanders turned their attention across the water to the real prize, the twin strongholds of Bairou and Sanga, where the knights and thousands of civilians were preparing for the decisive phase of the siege. From the Ottoman viewpoint, it was simple. If St. Elmo slowed their advance, then crushing Burgu and Sanga. In a single overwhelming blow would compensate for all lost time. The shift began before dawn. Ottoman gunners hauled their heaviest cannons across the peninsula, setting them on elevated platforms aimed directly at Burgu's walls. Fresh trenches snaked across the ground, each one dug at night by laborers who worked until their hands bled. When the sun rose, every battery was ready, positioned so that no square inch of the city could hide from them. The bombardment came without warning. Malta woke to sound that felt like the world splitting open. Cannonballs screamed overhead, smashing roofs, crushing parapets, and showering the streets with razor-sharp stone. Fragments, whole sections of Burgu's walls buckled under pounding. Hospitals overflowed before noon. Churches became shelters. The streets filled with dust so thick that men coughed blood. Still, the knights held the line under Valet's orders. Soldiers rotated every few hours to keep fatigue from collapsing the defenses. Civilians carried buckets of water to the battlements or hauled shattered stones to rebuild walls faster than the cannons could break them. And every time the Ottomans shifted their fire, Maltese gunners fired back, hitting enemy trenches with such precision that Ottoman casualties climbed far higher than expected. But the Ottomans were not relying on artillery alone. One of their boldest plans involved the sea. Sanga, one of Malta's strongest positions, sat on a peninsula protected by ocean on three sides. To assault it, the Ottomans needed a direct path across a narrow inlet separating their army from the city. So they built one under cover of darkness. Ottoman engineers assembled a massive floating bridge, a chain L platform of boats, planks, and music beams. It stretched silently across the water like a serpent. By dawn, janissaries were already assembling at its edge, preparing for surprise attack that would drive straight into Sanga's heart. It might have worked if not for a single observation tower. A Maltese lookout spotted the unnatural line on the water. He sounded the alarm. Valet reacted instantly. Gunners at the harbor's edge were ordered to load all available cannons with chain shot, lengths of iron linked together, designed to tear through wood like claws. The first volley shredded the bridge. The second broke it apart. When the third volley hit, the entire structure collapsed into the harbor, taking dozens of Ottoman soldiers with it. The water churned with debris, splintered wood, and bodies struggling to stay afloat. The surprise attack had been destroyed before it even began, but the Ottomans adapted, as they always did. Within days, they attempted a land assault on the Sanga Peninsula using a newly constructed siege tower, a monstrous multi-level structure taller than the city walls, covered in soaked hides to resist fire. From its upper platforms, enemy musketeers could fire down into the streets of Sanga. If they reached the walls, the tower would act as a bridge for troops to pour directly into the city. It was one music of the most dangerous moments of the siege. Valet's commanders responded with equal creativity. They ordered barges packed with barrels of gunpowder. Under cover of smoke, Maltese sailors rowed them close to the tower's base. Then they lit the fuses. The explosion tore into the tower's foundation, snapping music, support beams. The massive structure groaned, tilted, and with an echo that rolled across music, the entire harbor collapsed sideways, bearing dozens of Ottoman soldiers beneath music, a mountain of burning timber. The defenders cheered for the first time in weeks. Desperation now fueled both sides. The Ottomans intensified their bombardment of Burgu, focusing on a section of the wall already weakened by earlier strikes. After hours of pounding, the walls split open, creating a breach wide enough for two men to enter side by side. Janissaries rushed forward. The knights countered. What followed was not a battle, but a series of brutal collisions, wave after wave of Ottoman infantry slamming into hastily built barricades while knights and Maltese militia fought with swords, pikes, pistols, and even broken stones. At one point, Ottoman troops nearly seized part of the inner defenses. Valet himself entered the fray, sword drawn, refusing to leave the front line. Music, his presence turned panic into resolve, and the breach was held. Barely. Music, night brought no relief. Fires burned across the city. The heat of the bombardment glowed on the horizon like a second sunset. No one slept. No, one expected tomorrow to be easier. But for all its destruction, Malta had survived another day. And every day that passed pushed the Ottomans closer to exhaustion. The siege had now become a contest of endurance, not speed. And endurance was the one thing the knights had prepared for better than anyone realized. By late July, the siege had turned into something neither side had expected. Not a swift Ottoman victory, and not a desperate last stand by the knights, but a slow, grinding contest of endurance that was breaking both armies piece by piece. The heat was relentless. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air day and night. Rotting food, shattered siege, engines, collapsed tents, and makeshift graves covered the ground. And every night, the cries of wounded men drifted across the harbor, sometimes Ottoman, sometimes Maltese, constant reminders that human strength was never meant for this kind of suffering. Yet the Ottomans pushed forward, refusing to accept that the smallest island they had ever attacked was resisting them this. Fiercely, they intensified their night assaults, hoping exhaustion would break. The defenders where cannon fire had failed. Janissaries climbed ladders under the moonlight, shields raised against, flaming arrows and boiling oil poured from the walls. Some reached the battlements. Most never made it past a climb beneath the ground. Another battle was unfolding. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels under the fortifications, planning to collapse key bastions with buried gunpowder. They carved long, narrow passages in suffocating heat. Their goal was simple: open a hole where no defender expected one. But Malta learned to listen. Engineers pressed their ears to the ground and heard the faint scraping of tools beneath the stone. They began digging counter tunnels, tight airless caverns lit by single torches, and the two sides met underground in brutal close quarters combat. Men fought in darkness, choking on dust, swinging picks, knives, and bare fists. No formations, no commands, just instinct and desperation. In several cases, tunnels collapsed with both sides trapped inside, ending battles in silence beneath the earth. Above ground, news of St. Elmo's fall weeks earlier weighed on both armies. The Ottomans had paid thousands of lives for a single small fort. Every time a janissary looked across the harbor and saw the ruins, he remembered how much blood had been spilled for ground that should have been taken in days. For the knights, that sacrifice became a symbol, proof that impossible resistance was still possible if men refused to yield. By mid-August, the Ottomans attempted what they believed would be the decisive blow, a massive coordinated assault meant to end the siege in a single day. It almost succeeded. The bombardment that morning was the heaviest Malta had endured. Walls shook violently. Houses crumbled. Dust filled entire streets like rolling fog. Janissaries stormed the breaches with terrifying momentum, climbing rubble, leaping over barricades, and pushing into the defenders with the full strength of a military machine desperate to finish. What it had started, for the first time, sections of Berg's defenses began to fail. Vallet's officers warned that some battlements were collapsing, gunpowder, supplies were dangerously low, and the wounded outnumbered those still able to fight. Then came the moment historians still argue about. A group of Janissaries broke through and reached the inner defenses. They planted their banners. If reinforcements had followed, Berg might have fallen within minutes. But they didn't come. Some say Ottoman commanders hesitated. Some claim confusion in the chain of command. Whatever the cause, that brief delay gave Valet exactly what he needed, a unit of knights. Hospitaller charged into the breach and drove the Janissaries out with fury, born of exhaustion, fear, and the knowledge that this moment would decide the fate of the entire island. The banners fell, the attackers retreated, and something inside the Ottoman army cracked, as if the siege itself were not cruel enough. Disease began spreading through the Ottoman camp. Weeks of heat, foul water, and overcrowded trenches turned the encampment into a perfect breeding ground for illness. Men collapsed without wounds. Doctors could do little. Lines thinned. At the same time, mosquitoes gathered in swarms around the marshy ground near their positions. Malaria tore through the ranks. Commanders wrote grim reports to the Sultan. We are losing men without battle. The knights sensed music, the shift. For the first time since the siege began, the Ottomans were no longer pressing forward. They were struggling. Music just to hold their own position. The defenders grew louder at night, banging drums, shouting across the harbor, reminding the Ottomans that they were still standing, still breathing, still unbroken. But both sides knew the end was approaching. The Ottomans, afraid reinforcements might soon arrive, for the knights prepared one last great attack, larger, louder, more desperate than anything before. Drums thundered across the hills. Torches lit the night. Troops gathered in the thousands. This would be their final gamble. The knights prepared as well. Every defender was brought to the walls. Civilians grabbed weapons. Priests carried water and ammunition. Even the wounded crawled to the battlements to load muskets, unwilling to let the next sunrise determine their fate without them. As dawn approached, the air grew unnaturally still, that heavy electric quiet that always settles before a storm. The final Ottoman assault was coming, and no one on either side knew who would break first. When dawn finally broke on the morning of the last Ottoman assault, the horizon looked strange, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise on what was about to unfold. Every defender was at the walls. Every cannon was loaded. Every man, woman, and wounded fighter braced for the impact of an army that had nothing left to lose. The Ottomans struck with everything they had. The hills shook under the weight of thousands advancing at once. War cries rolled across the harbor like thunder. Cannon fire exploded from land and sea, together hitting the walls so hard that entire sections trembled as if they were breathing. Janissaries charged through the smoke, climbing over rubble, pushing ladders into place, firing muskets so rapidly that the air turned into a storm of sparks and dust. Inside Burgu and Sanga, the defenders fought with the last fragments of strength they had. Knights swung sword with bandaged arms. Civilians threw stones from rooftops. Musketeers reloaded until their hands bled. There was no strategy left, only instinct, only the raw will to keep the enemy out for one more minute, then one more after that. At one point, it seemed the Ottomans might finally win. A large breach opened near the seawall. Janissaries surged through it, knocking defenders aside, planting their feet, inside the city for the first time since. The siege began. The fight turned into chaos, screams, ash clashing steel. A blur where no one could tell who was standing or falling. But Malta still had one last weapon left. Desperation. Music, a group of Maltese militia. Some barely old enough to fight. Some old enough to be grandfathers, charged the breach with nothing but spears, axes, and the sheer refusal to let their homes burn. Their attack stalled the Ottoman, advanced just long enough for the knights to regroup and strike the Janissaries from the flank. Step by step, foot by foot, the defenders' music pushed the Ottomans back through the breach. And then suddenly, when the momentum shifted, the Ottoman line wavered. Their soldiers hesitated. After months of fighting, disease, losses, hunger, and unending resistance, something inside their ranks finally cracked. What began as a step backward turned into a retreat. What began as a retreat turned into an unraveling. Officers shouted commands that no one obeyed anymore. The final attack had failed. Across the battlefield, the Ottomans pulled back in confusion, some collapsing from exhaustion, others too weak to carry their weapons. The defenders could hardly believe it. Many stood frozen, shocked that this time the enemy wasn't circling back for another wave. Then came the moment that ended it all. A scout at the top of Burgos. Music, highest tower shouted at sails, were visible on the horizon. Dozens, music of them. Reinforcements from Sicily, long delayed, had finally arrived. The Ottoman commanders understood music instantly what that meant. They could not win now, not with their army already broken. Music not with fresh Christian troops landing. Behind them, orders were given. The Ottoman camp erupted into chaotic motion as soldiers' music dismantled tents, abandoned siege works, carried the wounded to ships, music, and tried to salvage what little remained of their supplies. The once mighty invasion force, music, that had arrived like a black cloud across the water, now fled the same way. Battered, music, starving, reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Malta, music, did not cheer at first. It was too surreal, too unbelievable, too heavy. Music with the weight of everything they had endured. But when the last Ottoman ship pulled away from the shore, a sound rose from Berku and Sanga. Not a shout, not music, a roar, but a rolling wave of relief that felt almost like wind. Men sank to their music knees. Women embraced strangers. Priests rang church bells until the ropes burned their palms. The island had survived. In the music weeks that followed, the scale of what had happened became clear. More than half of the Ottoman invasion force music had been lost. The siege, that was expected to last a few days, had stretched music into nearly 4 brutal months. A small island that should have fallen in a single, overwhelming blow had instead held off the strongest empire on earth. For Europe, music, the victory was more than military. It was psychological. It proved that the Ottoman advance, seemingly unstoppable music for over a century, could be resisted. It showed that courage, preparation, and sheer stubbornness, music, could reshape history even when the odds were impossible. For the knights, the siege became their defining chapter. Malta, once a harsh rock in the sea, became a symbol of resilience. St. Elmo, music, became sacred ground. And Jean de Valet, who had refused to abandon the island even when the situation looked music hopeless, was remembered not just as a commander, but as the man who turned Malta into music, a fortress of the human spirit. But the greatest legacy of the Great Siege was something simpler and far more human. It was the reminder, music, that sometimes the world changes not because of armies or empires, but because music, ordinary people choose not to break, because they choose to stand even when standing seems impossible. When the siege ended, Malta's walls were shattered, its music, streets burned, and its people exhausted, but they were alive. And in history, music survival can be the greatest victory of all.